Hello, everyone. Thomas Huddleston here with Liège. And what we wanted to talk about with you is ongoing research that Giacomo and I are conducting based on our experience with the design of the previous edition of the Migrant Integration Policy Index, MIPEX. All of this information is publicly available, but we were kind of wrestling with deeper questions that I think that are still reemerging in integration policy research. So one is this question about how do we categorize integration policies around the world? Are these national models of integration really dead? Or as we get more information from around the world, is it bringing back these discussions about what are maybe some of the different categories or underlying dimensions that we start to see emerging around the world? And so related to that, we have seen an explosion in the number of policy indicators, of which MIPEX is only one example. But these measures tend to only provide kind of unidimensional or sometimes multidimensional measures of these policies. And so we want to look and see, are these the right types of ways of measuring differences in integration policies? Or again, might there be some underlying dimensions or approaches that we can identify, drawing both on theory, but also on more exploratory analysis? And that's going to be the structure of our presentation today.
Yes, indeed. So when we talk about integration or approaches toward integration or integration models, we need to take into account the typologies and the work done in the 90s by several authors like Brubaker, but also Castle, and in general the work that they put forward on let's say on this or the threefold typology that they put forward. As I said, in the 90s, the assimilationiistic model represented, let's say, by France, the multiculturalistic or also called pluralistic model, then both from Anglo-Saxon countries or Scandinavian countries in Europe and Anglo-Saxon country outside Europe like Canada and the US, and then the differential exclusionist / ethnic model, like, for example, in the case of Germany. Also, literature, like follow-up literature, I would say, presented also or introduces also a kind of fourth approach towards integration, fourth model, which is a residual one more, and it's the so-called laissez-faire approach, typical of Southern European countries. I guess we all know a little bit about this 3+1 typology, but just to summarize it. So the first model, the one that when we think about is the German approach, let's say, as I said, called differential exclusionist or ethnic model, sees migrants as temporary or person that they are residing in the country temporary, and they see them as guest workers. So when it comes, for example, to citizen acquisition, the idea is that the acquisition is based on the parent's nationality, the so-called jus sanguinis, and therefore it's difficult for migrants with no roots in the country to become citizen. And the social policy side, let's say, of this model is more linked to support migrants' integration in the labor market. And for example, other kind of integration, like for example, linked to family reunion, are much more difficult compared to the other model. The second model, which is France, the one summarized by the French case, in a way sees or conceive migrants as citizens to be. So people that would be assimilated in a way and then eventually acquire the citizenship. So here the idea, for example, in terms of citizenship acquisition, is based on the jus soli, so right by birth. In a way, it's a little bit easier than, for example, acquisition in the other model, and it's more open, the idea to long-term residence. the approach toward integration and support for integration in terms of social policies is more mainstream, to say less specific, but there is a general support to integration and especially naturalization. The last model of a threefold typology is the one summarized by or exemplified by, for example, Canada and the US on the one hand, or UK, Netherlands, and Sweden in Europe. And here it's more the multicultural approach that we all know, in which migrants are conceived as belonging to a community with differences that are respected, but there are differences, let's say, in the way that the model considers migrants. Its acquisition of citizenship is in a way easier compared to the other two approach models, especially in non-European countries, and also migrants can access long-term residence after a few years. The support for integration is conceived as support for the communities and support to avoid that migrants are discriminated, so in terms of anti-discrimination policies. As I said, there is also an additional fourth approach emerging from literature, not from the classical threefold typology, but afterwards literature, in which the idea is that there is a residual approach typical of Southern European countries, which is in a way characterized by a lack of clear rationale and regulation, a more emergency-based approach in which there is, for example, there have been in Italy, for example, several post-entry regularization programs, a strong role in terms of support for integration of the civic society, and a very restrictive access to nationality based on the jus sanguinis. So, Thomas.
These national models, which many of you are familiar with, in many ways have been abandoned by migration researchers who not only see longitudinal change over time, but such as the so-called civic turn in the 2000s, where the adoption of anti-discrimination policies on the one hand, but also kind of language and civic requirements for access to rights on the other, would have led to a limited differentiation between these countries, right? But beyond this supposed civic term, there's also been kind of a questioning of attempts to measure policy around a specific model. So desires to move away from supposed national philosophies and self-definition and more to more thematic empirical measures of each policy area, looking not just at the traditional policy areas such as citizenship, but looking at areas that are equally important for integration, such as health and education. And then looking more in depth at variations between not only the model countries, but a wider variety of countries, looking for variation within these policies in specific countries, and then identifying a multiplicity of areas of convergence or divergence. And again, this has really come forward with the development of policy indicators that allow us to get a much more nuanced view of integration policies at quite in so many areas of life. So while you might assume that all of these discussions on national models are dead and we are just happy to live in the details, on the other hand, migration researchers have constantly come back to the question of what might be some of the underlying dimensions still across all of these areas of policy. Particularly because we have a lot of integration theory and integration policy theory that helps us to identify what might be underlying structural dimensions that cut across different policy areas. So many of you are familiar with the work of John Barry, whose acculturation approaches help us to see individual and group strategies to kind of navigate life in a new receiving country based on two dimensions of whether individuals choose or are encouraged to maintain their culture and identity, and whether individuals are encouraged to develop multiple relationships with individuals in the receiving society or with their own immigrant groups, right? So these two dimensions of culture and identity and relationship help to differentiate what might be various integration strategies used at the individual level by immigrants, but also what might explain different public attitudes towards immigrants, and perhaps at a meso or a macro level, different group dynamics or different policy dynamics. So Barry's model has also given rise to greater reflection on different policy models, drawing primarily on theories of integration and integration policy. So this work you might be familiar with from Koopmans and Michalowski tried to see if countries' integration policies differ along two theorized axes. So one would be an axis of individual rights, which you see here on the x-axis, that across all of these different areas of integration policy, there are certain policy choices, rights, supports that you can give, which further an individual's access to rights, to social rights, political rights, to legal citizenship. Or you could instead restrict access to those rights. On the other axis of cultural rights, here on the y-axis, you would see that across these different policy areas, countries could be offering group differentiated rights based on immigrants' race, culture, or religion. So offering a wide degree of rights to different new recognized cultural groups, or restricting those rights to, for example, only those in the dominant majority group. And the typology proposed by Koopmans and Michalowski are interesting, right? You could imagine that there are countries that give wide civic and cultural rights that are typically the multicultural model that we talked about, or civic pluralism. You could imagine countries that restrict individual and cultural rights that are primarily reinforcing an ethno-national conception of integration. You could conceive of those traditionally assimilationist models as typifying countries that would give wide civic individual rights, but restricting individual cultural rights in a form of civic republicanism. Or you could also theoretically imagine countries where immigrants benefit from few individual civic rights, but are granted different forms of cultural rights. And Koopmans and Michalowski, as we see in the next slide, have tried to map their measures of integration policy in different countries onto these different axes. Their first work from Koopmans' first work from 2005, later developed in cooperation with Michalowski in 2017. The axis is flipped, as you can see, which is why I've had to kind of color code it to make it a little easier for you to see. And so while these dimensions are certainly interesting, we see quite a different set of approaches. At the same time, you can question whether these more theory-driven approaches to categorizing integration policy are really an empirical reality. In this case, you can see that in many cases, countries that grant civic rights also grant cultural rights, or they restrict both ethnic they restrict both individual rights and cultural rights. So there is a certain correlation, let's say, between the two underlying dimensions, which is not ideal for creating categorization. But looking instead to citizenship policies, the work by Vink and Baubach have tried to engage with the great empirical material that we have on modes of citizenship acquisition through the Global Citizenship Observatory, in order to look and see, well, which citizenship modes are most significant in terms of their variation across countries for predicting a potential difference in approach, because there can be relationships between these various modes of acquisition and can lead to quite a good amount of differentiation between approaches. And so here you see their citizenship configurations on the x-axis of whether countries are very territorially inclusive, providing various liberalized modes of acquisition for immigrants who are resident on the territory, as opposed to being very ethnoculturally inclusive, offering a wide variety of modes of citizenship for people, regardless of their place of residence, but who have certain ethno-cultural or historical ties with the country. And based on this, you can see that Baubeck and Vink have come up with four very interesting and distinct citizenship configurations that can now be applied globally. So based on this persistence, let's say, of discussions around national models and the challenges, but also the opportunities of categorizing integration policy, we recognize that future discussions of integration policy can't just be driven by theory. They also need to draw on this wider empirical set of mappings that we have of different types of integration policies. They need to move beyond the typical Western European countries that have been the focus of most studies, providing a relatively small sample size, and particularly move beyond the traditional destination countries in a more Eurocentric approach to this field. We need to instead look beyond to the main global destination countries.
Yes. So well, first 2004 and then 2007, Thomas and other colleagues created the Migrant Integration Policy Index, really following this new wave of study and reasoning and analysis using policy indicators. In the last wave, in the last edition, in the latest edition of MIPEX, which was done in 2020, where I can skip this. We looked, sorry, maybe first, well, if you're not familiar, MIPEX is a set of indicators that are then aggregated to create a summary score, so an index, which represent the state of policy, of integration policy in one given country in one given year, like, for example, Italy in 2014. This is an example of policy indicators, and the way that are so policy indicators are sorted in policy areas, and I will talk in the next slide about about that. And for each policy area, we calculate an average of the indicators from 0, the most restrictive, to 100, the most open, the most inclusive policies, and then each policy area score, the policy area scores and are then averaged to create the overall MIPEX score. More in general, in the last edition in 2020, as I already said, we look at policy from 2014 to 2019, and we decide to widen the scope of our analysis by including 56 countries from all over the world. For example, adding Latin American countries, in Africa, South Africa, countries from the Arab Peninsula, but also India, Indonesia, China, and Russia, and also to systematize the knowledge that, or this did several spin-offs, let's say, that were created over the years, like, for example, in the Balkans. The idea is to look at a wide range of policies and policy areas related to migrant integration. We look mainly at 8 policy areas, like from labor market to education, from political participation to healthcare, from permanent resident to citizenship acquisition and naturalization. And this area, or the choice of this area, was based, first of all, on the state of the art, of course, but then it was also they were also based, and also the choice of the indicators within each area, it was also based on policy experts, on researchers that we were in contact with, and we discussed the indicators and the policy areas to come up with a set of indicators that really summarize the state of policy on a specific policy area. The idea behind MIPEX is to look at the combination of access to rights and the support, both mainstream and targeted support provided to migrants, so that migrants can access or not. We looked mainly at 3 different groups of migrants. Migrant workers, they are not in a permanent position, they don't have a permanent, well, a permanent status, sorry, but they are in the country or they have status for longer than more 1 year. Family reunited migrants and permanent residents. In the last edition, the questionnaire was composed of 58 indicators, which again were created before in 2007, based on some international equality standards like UN regulation or EU regulation. And our methodology was based on a standardized questionnaire. As I said, it was sent to a national expert. And then we conducted centralized checks to check for the answer and to confirm also the scores provided by the national experts. Then Thomas.
So the MIPEX, as some of you are familiar with, provides this multidimensional measure of integration policy. So we can see to what extent integration policies are well developed or underdeveloped in these 8 areas that are critical to immigrants' well-being. And these measures are used extensively by migration researchers to see what are the drivers of these policies and also what are the effects. They've been used over quite some time and are found to be very reliable measures of these specific policy areas. So you get a good measure of which countries have a very restrictive approach to citizenship, which countries have very well-developed anti-discrimination policies, which countries have weak education policies for migrants, and so on. But we also can look at the overall measure, which is a simple average of these 8 areas, to get a kind of unidimensional measure of what are integration policies. So which countries tend to have the most well-developed support, which are the most inclusive, and which have the most underdeveloped, which ones are the most restrictive. So the darker pink gets a higher score, the darker blue gets a lower score. And you can see that we have quite a range of policy approaches around the world. And this unidimensional measure of MIPEX has been used quite a bit to, again, explain the link between these policies and immigrants' outcomes and well-being and public attitudes. So it is an interesting measure in itself, but of course, I think the question that all of us are asking is what's underlying this variation? Yes, there are differences in the development and policy in these 8 areas, but do we see any common underlying dimensions that would help us to explain this variation?
Yeah, that is exactly the question that we asked ourselves after collecting the data in the last edition, and we really thought about how to go beyond the 8 policy area division and approach, which we think, as Thomas said, it's extremely useful to understand the state of policy in each of the different area. But we want also to know a little bit more about the dimension underneath, also to start approaching the topic of policy models or policy approach. So to do that, we decide to do some quantitative analysis, and we run, we use a methodology called categorical principal component analysis. And the idea categorical because the MIPEX scores are actually, or the MIPEX variable, the MIPEX indicators are actually ordinal variables because the possible score are very often 0, 50, or 100 only. So it's not a continuous variable. And the idea to use PCA is because PCA reduces a large number of variables. and by creating, let's say, a number of course, fewer dimension. So by running the CACHPA, we saw that there were like 3 dimensions based on the eigenvalue, which is normally the one used to understand the number of dimensions that we should select. There were 3 dimensions standing out, and they were explaining the majority of the variance in our data set. So we then identified for each dimension, emerging dimension, the variables that were correlated the most, linked the most to each of the dimension, to understand and to come up, let's say, with a definition of these 3 dimensions. The first dimension, emergence, we decide to call, let's say, the first dimension access to basic rights. Here, it really talks, well, this dimension, let's say, really relates to the eligibility and the equality of rights, so access to right, as I said, in terms of access to right to work, to train somehow, to access the healthcare system, and to not be discriminated in a way. The second dimension is related to possibilities, let's say, for equal opportunities. Here we talk more in terms, or the dimension, let's say, refers more to targeted support in for example, labor market, education, as considered, let's say, by policymakers as something more advanced to improve the situation in the country. Support, for example, to access the healthcare system. So the first dimension is really related to, for example, access to the healthcare system, while the second one is to provide opportunities beyond the rights, let's say, to enjoy, in a way, if needed, the healthcare system. And as an additional dimension, or as an additional opportunity to participate politically in the society of settlement. Here it relates also to access and, in a way, flexibility for families, for permanent residents, and also access to nationality. These 3 dimensions, so family reunion, permanent residence, and access to nationality, are also clearly linked to the third dimension, which we decide to call let's say, long-term settlement, because it refers to having a secure future in the country in terms of requirements and procedure on these 3 aspects of family reunification, permanent residence, and naturalization. But as you can see from the indicators, the idea behind this dimension is also to have some cultural requirements linked to access to family reunification, permanent residence, and naturalization. So it's different from the second one, and it's especially characterized also by these cultural, let's say, obstacles that law and the legal system can foresee. But this is just a summary. And then to have a better, let's say, idea of each country position or score, actually, on this 3 dimension, what we did is to calculate for each dimension the average of the related indicators, so the one that they have a higher correlation, as you saw in the previous slides, to come up with a score for each country, for each year, of course, for each of the 3 dimensions. Here, we present the average for the 56 migrant country, and you can see that although all the 3 dimensions on average are favorable in a way, well, all policies are favorable in all the 3 dimensions, basic rights is the policy area or the dimension where policies are more favorable compared to the other 2. We thought it's also interesting a little bit to analyze some differences, some geographical differences for each of the 3 dimensions. Well, we can see that in general, on basic rights, there is a division between the Western world, especially Europe, and Americas plus Australia, and the non-Western world, mainly Asian countries in our analysis. While the situation is a little bit different for equal opportunities, where I would say, well, we would say that one of the main, I would say, reason for explaining having more favorable or less favorable policies is to be a long-term country or a traditional country of immigration, like in the case of non-European traditional countries like the US or Canada. While countries, especially non-European countries, in which or that they have a less traditional, less long-standing tradition of immigration, they have more restrictive policies in terms of equal opportunities. Let's say the situation is a little bit different, and I think it's very interesting when it comes to long-term security. Since this third dimension really focus on this cultural aspect, these cultural requirements linked to long-term settlement, we can see that the only region, in a way, that puts effort or that puts a strong focus on this cultural criteria, cultural requirements, is Europe. While I would say, and we will talk more about that when we're going to talk about the approaches, this aspect is less important for very different reasons in both long-standing traditional countries, like as I said, the US, Canada, or Australia, but also in the new country of immigration, like the Asian countries or even the Eastern European countries. So, Thomas?
You see that the dimensions of integration policy certainly lead to interesting variation across countries, but we also wanted to see how these three dimensions combined together. Could we see different groupings of countries in terms of how their policies support these three underlying dimensions? So for this, we undertook a cluster analysis. We won't go into that at this point, but it allows us to see how countries group together along the three dimensions, which dimensions are kind of stronger or weaker in different groupings of countries, which I'm going to explain now. So we found 5 overall approaches based on these 3 underlying dimensions of rights, opportunities, and security. So the first cluster we call our top 10 because these countries basically score highly in all indicators, in all areas, in all dimensions. And what these countries' policies do is they tend to guarantee equal rights, equal opportunities, and equal long-term security. The second cluster has a similar approach in the sense that you see relatively positive scores in all 3 dimensions, but not to the same extent as in the top 10. So we call these also our comprehensive countries because you see that the country's approach is trying to assure most rights, most opportunities, and most forms of security for immigrants. Our third cluster is a very different approach, which we are calling temporary integration. So these are countries whose approaches tend to guarantee equal rights and equal opportunities for immigrants, but without the kind of long-term security that immigrants could have to be certain of their future in the country. Another very different type of approach we call equality on paper. So these are countries whose approaches tend to guarantee immigrants with basic rights and some form of long-term security, but offer hardly any targeted supports to guarantee equal opportunities. You could say in some way they do not want to change underlying structures and systems in their country as part of their new reality as a country of immigration. And then the fifth cluster of countries are those that we call immigration without integration. So in these countries, immigrants can have some form of long-term security. They have found some way to obtain legal status within the country. There are ways for them to continue that status in some way, but they will have to have a future in the country without having basic rights. And again, without having any attention to their specific needs, any targeted support to guarantee equal opportunities. So here you see these five clusters visualized around the world, first by color. So our first cluster, the top 10 comprehensive countries, let's say they're in the gold, the light yellow. The cluster 2 of comprehensive integration approaches are, let's say, in the bronze, in the darker brown. Then the cluster 3 of the temporary approach to integration is in green. The equality on paper, cluster 4, is in purple. And cluster 5, immigration without integration, is in red. Now, what makes this visualization more complicated is we found that within each cluster, there was still some substantial variation. So countries might have a similar approach. They have similar dimensions that are present or missing, but some countries within that approach are more developed than others. So that's where you see that we have developed sub-labels, sub-levels within a specific approach. And I think this is all very useful looking at the clusters and the levels to, again, look at some of the regional differences. So as Giacomo mentioned, we do see that the traditional long-standing destination countries in North America or in Oceania tend to have a comprehensive approach. We do not see one common approach across Europe. And in fact, we see quite variations in Western Europe between a comprehensive approach and a more temporary approach. We do not see any particular Mediterranean model. We do not find one particular Nordic model. We also do not even find one particular Central European model, right? Whereas in Central Europe, yes, generally speaking, it's an equality on paper approach. We do see countries that are just beginning to adopt a very basic comprehensive approach to integration, like Czechia, Estonia, or Turkey. Whereas among really the very new and emerging destination countries, in our case, in Asia, we mostly see an immigration without an integration approach, though not only, we also see that in Cyprus. And again, we also see, though, different approaches, say, between Japan and South Korea. So our looking to the future, we're asking ourselves how countries maybe move between these different approaches to integration, and whether there are any links between them. You could imagine, for example, that a country that does not recognize itself as a country of immigration would be in this fifth category of immigration without integration. All countries have ways for people to move to a country, but they might not guarantee these basic rights and equal opportunities. And then perhaps over time, countries make a choice. We don't know if they tend to pass through one cluster or another. Here you see them all on equal level. Countries could opt to guarantee basic rights, but without addressing equal opportunities like equality on paper. Or they could choose to guarantee basic rights and equal opportunities, but for some reason undermine the path towards longer term settlement. Or they might start on this comprehensive approach, addressing rights, opportunities, and security, and eventually fully recognize themselves, identify themselves as the country of immigration, perhaps. But this is one of our questions of how do countries move between different stages and levels of integration policy, as we have seen countries in our sample change approach over time.
Yes, and also to conclude, we would like to link a little bit the traditional, let's say, debate on integration models with the new emerging approaches that we found. We saw in a way that the countries, especially the non-European countries that are traditionally that have traditionally or had traditionally a multiculturalist approach, they are now adopted in our terms a more comprehensive approach. In Europe, although there is indeed no common approach, but if we look at the Western Europe, especially the Central Corridor, let's say we can see that by and large, let's say the temporary approach is the most common one. And France, for example, is an example of a country that had in the past, or at least in this traditional view, a more asymmetristic approach, and now is adopting a temporary approach similar in a way, although still different, of course, to Germany. This is also related to our third dimension, which strongly emphasizes the cultural aspect of integration. So from our perspective, it makes sense in our definition. We confirm that in a way, Central European countries like Germany, but also Austria and Switzerland still apply a temporary approach, although of course they moved a little bit forward, let's say, but still this idea of the guest workers is somehow still emerging from our analysis. Then we were able, and I think it's one of the contributions of our analysis, to look at or to show also two other new, or at least not often analyzed approaches. The first one is this equality on paper approach, typical of Eastern European and somehow Latin American countries, that it's a subordinate inclusionist approach, a second tier inclusion in a way, as an approach. And the second approach is the one of non-European destinations, basically Asian countries, which is in a way, it's a new elitist model, in a way conceived for high-skilled migrants. Indeed, there is no effort, for example, not focus on the cultural aspect of integration, also for long-term settlement, but most often there is only one criteria in terms of long settlement, which is the economic one, so the salary or the amount of money that migrants have. These countries are also characterized by very tough admission policies, but when people are in the country, as long as they meet the initial criteria, they can, in a way, stay. So in these new countries, this new model is characterized by integration in a way that is discouraged, a settlement that it's open but to few skilled or at least wealthy workers, and the culture issue, the cultural aspect of integration is somehow disregarded on or unregulated. So thank you so much.